Hi, I'm Steve Jeremont. Welcome back to my channel. In my last video, I showed the process of photographing a multi-row panorama and the extent that I had to go to put that image together for the final product. When I was editing the video, I realized I didn't go into much detail as to what a panorama was, or why you would want to do it, or the tools that you might want to use to do it. So that's the subject for this video. And what I wanted to talk about first is, what exactly do you call this thing? I called it a multi-row panorama. People call them panoramas, people call them stitched images, collages, mosaics, assemblages. I have yet to find a word that I like that adequately describes what I do. And the reason being, panorama implies an image that is much wider than it is tall. And that's how a lot of these images are. There are a lot of subjects that lend themselves to that orientation. Cityscapes, ocean scenes, anything with a large, wide horizon, mountain ranges. The famous Michael Jordan wingspan image where he's holding his arms out and holding a basketball in one hand. All of those are examples of traditional panoramas. There are cameras in the film days that were dedicated to shooting that format, the 6x17 format in particular. And I've done those, but the images that I shoot don't always end up in that perspective, that orientation. A multi-row panorama technique lends itself to producing images that are in pretty much any image height to width ratio. The classic 3:2 for 35mm, 4:5. I've done images that you would not know inherently were shot as multi-row panoramas. I've done images that I'll talk about later that I did as a multi-row panorama because I had to due to a technical limitation. And you wouldn't see this image and think of it as something that, oh, that must have been done with a multi-row panorama, or a stitched image, or a collage. So probably in the course of making this video, I'm going to call this type of image by every term I know, and we'll see what sticks. If you have an opinion, let me know in the comments what you like to call it. But getting back to how you do this. I've seen photographers shoot the pieces of their collage freehand. No tripod, just click, 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 click. I've seen photographers put their camera on their tripod and just move it by panning the head. Then there are tools that you can put on your tripod to help you shoot in a controlled manner to try to minimize the amount of distortion that will result in the image when it's finally stitched all together. And this is such an example. Now this, what I've got in my hand here, used to be sold as a panorama kit by Really Right Stuff. It was actually just a collection of pieces that they already had for other purposes. And that's why I went with this, because I had some of those pieces already and I just filled out the rest of it. Really Right Stuff now has kits that are dedicated to just panos. So they're a little different than this, but the concept is the same. And I'll separate this out to show you the different pieces. And first is a rail that fits in the tripod head. And the rail can be, in my kit, it's a rail that you put other pieces on. I've seen people use a rail like this that has a clamp for your Arca Swiss style plate where you would clamp your camera down and still rotate with the head. The clamp allows you to move forward and back along the length of the lens and the camera body to allow you to find what's called the nodal point. And the nodal point eliminates parallax. Parallax being if you hold a finger out and point it so it lines up with something in the distance, and you close your left eye and then close your right eye, your finger appears to move in relation to that background object. That's parallax. And if I just put the camera down on the tripod and I was shooting a scene that had a significant spatial difference between the foreground and background, and I started panning the camera across the scene, I would get some parallax, most likely, depending on how wide the view of the lens was and the relative distance from the foreground to background. So there are techniques that I'll show later in the video for finding the nodal point for each lens and camera combination that you've got. The same focal length on different cameras will have a different nodal point. Different lens types will have different nodal points. So you need to test all the gear that you're going to use for this technique. But the point is to find the point along a scale on a rail like this, where by putting that in the by putting your nodal point right in the middle of the rotation where it will rotate, you can eliminate that parallax and the images will line up much better. Now, one thing that I want to test, and I'll probably document this in a future video, is I started doing this many years ago, and the software, Photoshop primarily, and other pieces of software, had trouble when your parallax point shifts across your images. I have a feeling that software's gotten a lot better, and I really want to test whether something like this is truly necessary today. And I'll do that in a future video. So if you're thinking of buying a kit to do this Panorama stuff, hold off until after that video. Maybe it's not really necessary anymore, but we'll see. I'm going to proceed with the rest of this video as if it is. The kit that I have, let me take this back off, starts with this rail that does not have any kind of clamp on it. It's just a rail. It does have a bubble level, so that's nice. And the second piece is this vertical arm that has a rotating plate on it. And I put that as the vertical piece of the whole kit. And then I come back to the rail with the clamp. And this combination of pieces allows me to not only create a horizontal panorama, but also move the camera up and down to create the multiple rows. And the rotating piece here has a scale along its entire circumference, and two lines that you can use depending on where it ends up positioned, so that you can see, and you can mark off, as I showed you in my last video, how many lines on the scale to move it, so you can move it consistently from row to row. Now, I do have one other piece that I talked about in the last video, and I'll show that now. And it's another rotating plate. And This is something that I haven't seen a lot of people use. By starting out with a rotating plate on the tripod head, as I mentioned in my last video, it allows me to not worry so much about how level the tripod itself is, because I can correct any imbalances with the tripod head. Now, if I had done that without a panning head like this, let me tilt this tripod a bit. Let's say the environment you're in, for whatever reason, you can't get the tripod level, or you just don't want to mess with it because it takes forever to level the tripod, especially if you've got spinning locks like I've got. If you don't level the tripod head, as you pan, it's going to slope either down or up across the scene. And that's really bad. And when you stitch the images together, you'll see that slope. You'll have a lot of white space along the edges of the image that will cause you to either crop in on the scene and possibly lose something that's important to the image, or what. If you fix the leveling with your tripod head, and I've got a bubble level here that I'm looking at, but you only use your tripod head, your point of rotation is down here and it's still not level. This might be level in this position, but as you rotate, it's going to go out of level. So this is not a good thing to do. You're not leveling across the width of the image. However, if you've got a rotating plate like this, and you level your tripod head, now your point of rotation is up here, not down here. So as you rotate, it's still level. And that's why I've got this, and I combine it with all this. So now I rotate up here and not down here. And that's how I put my kit together to do a multi-row pano. Now, some things that I've discovered as time goes on, especially when I bought into the GFX line of cameras. With this 63mm lens, I originally had just this fairly long rail. I think it's a 8-inch rail. And what I discovered, if I can get this clamped, it's always easiest in the field. What I discovered, and I'll rotate to see if you can see this, but the rail is longer than the lens. And the space between the lens and the rail is just, well, let me take the hood off, is barely larger than my forefinger. And I found that I couldn't put my Lee filter holder on the lens with this rail. So what I did is I bought a short rail that has the same clamp. And I use this with the 63 and the shorter lenses that I have with the GFX, the 45mm for instance. I'll use this short rail. But then I thought I was being clever by doing that. But what I discovered, let me show you. So this rail is almost exactly as long as my 63mm lens. And what happens when I put the Lee filter holder on it, it bumps right on the edge of that rail. And what it does is it prevents the lens from activating when you turn the camera on. Let me see if I can show you what happens when you turn on the Fuji GFX and these focus by wire lenses. See if this works. See how that moved out? So the front element of the lens does this. What happened when the Lee filter holder is on, it can't do that. It gets caught. And it causes the camera to give you the dreaded, please turn off the camera and turn it on again error. And I hate that. So what I found is when I'm using the 63 millimeter lens, and I think it's just the 63 millimeter lens that does this, I need to put a step-up ring between the lens and the Lee filter holder. And that pushes the Lee filter holder out just enough to clear this rail. The things I had to do to continue with my fascination with resolution. And so that gets me to my next topic. Ooh, I'm not locked down. Is the benefits of doing this technique, whether you're creating a pano or an image that's going to look like a normal image, is resolution. I've done images that have ridiculous resolving power, and I'll show a few over the course of this video. I have the first multi-row stitch that I did with the Fuji GFX in the 63 millimeter lens was at Horseshoe Bend in northern Arizona. And I shot a sunset scene, started with the clouds, and by the time I was shooting into the canyon, the final row of the assembly, it was almost pitch black. And I was having difficulty seeing the scale on the pano head. And I didn't want to use a headlamp because I didn't want any glow to be in the scene other than what was being cast by the sunset. So I wound up shooting, I was very cautious with the amount of rotation I did between images. And I wound up shooting a lot more images than I really needed to cover that scene. I think I had 60 some odd images from the GFX. But when I assembled the image, I noticed there was a little dot in the Colorado River. And I thought, was that a spot on my sensor? It was a new camera. I was going to be a little ticked if it had a spot on it already. But when I zoomed in to that spot, I discovered it wasn't a spot on the sensor. It was a boat in the Colorado River with two guys in it fishing. And in the full raw stitched image, you can actually make out the fishing line from one of the fishing poles. That's the kind of resolution that this technique can give you. There's a campground, I don't know if it's a campground or just a resting area for boaters going along the Colorado, where you can clearly make out footsteps along the walking paths and a shelter that's there. It's really quite remarkable how much resolution there is in this scene due to the fact that every image was shot with a 63 millimeter lens when it would have taken on a medium format probably a 20 millimeter or 18 millimeter to shoot that entire scene in one image. So you're shooting a much more magnified view of every piece of the image that gets put together. So your total resolution is way up there versus a single image. And that's what I really like. Even though I might print the image in a way that resolution never really gets noticed or seen, I like to know that it's there. It tickles me inside to know that I can count the bricks on this house 2 miles in the distance. I can see power lines on the horizon way out there, even though they'll never come out in a print that I made. Although I will say that I was told by the owner of one of the Sedona Tap House locations that have that Horseshoe Bend sunset image that he saw that dot in the water and the picture was hanging in a way that he couldn't get a clear view of it. It was higher up than he was tall. And he took his phone and took a picture of that area just to see what that was, because he knew it wasn't anything on the print. And he magnified it on his phone and saw it was a boat, and that really made him smile, knowing that was, that image had that kind of resolution. So that's why I do this. You've seen how I do it. I've walked through the kit that I have. And I think it might be time to give you a tutorial on how you find the nodal point of a lens. And I will apologize to start out that I wanted to do this outside using materials that you could pick up anywhere. 2 dowel rods from a hardware store, put some colored tape or paint the tips so that you can clearly differentiate what's the foreground and what's the background. But we've had so much rain and snow this winter that I don't think my yard is going to dry out until somewhere in August. So no shooting in my backyard for me until I'm not going to sink into my knees. So I'm filming this in my basement. I've got a pool table right here. I've got some wine stoppers that I use for this when I'm inside to test the nodal point. So I'm going to show you using that setup, but you can really use anything that will stay steady and where you can line up pretty accurately between the foreground and background, and then rotate your camera to see how the background shifts in relation to the foreground. So I'll walk through that tutorial. I've got to move things around. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. A little bit about my setup. I've got a reusable wine stopper here at the front part of the pool table, another one at the back. I'm using my GFX with the 63mm lens to put video out straight to my Atomos Ninja 5 recorder, and I can record the camera output straight to the recorder, which I'm doing now. I have my camera on the long nodal slide so that you can see the difference in the parallax as I go from one extreme to the other. Right now I've got the camera slid all the way forward, so it is going to be well behind the nodal point, and I've got the camera lined up so that the foreground wine stopper and the background wine stopper are right on top of each other. And as I move the camera left and right, you'll see the parallax. So I'm moving it all the way to the right, and we see that the background shifted to the right relative to the foreground. And as I move it left, it moves all the way to the left. And if I move the slide all the way forward, or back, sorry, and line up everything, and move the slide left or pivot left and right, it's reversed. If you're in front of the nodal point, the background will shift to the left in the opposite way that you're moving the camera. So I move the camera right, it shifted left. Move it left, it shifts right. Now, a quick and dirty way of finding the nodal point is to slide it so you see the parallax difference, and then move the slide so that the foreground and background object will line up again. And now, if I move that, we can see that it's still pretty well lined up. Tweak it just a little bit and move it back. Right about there, that is the nodal point for this lens. Let me lock it down. And we can see as I shift left and right, there is no parallax shifting of the foreground and background. So then I look on the slide and I see that this is at 9 1/2. based on the slide, the measurements on the slide. So I record that, and I know with this slide, 9.5. And I'll do this with my short slide, so I know what its measurement is, because I don't know that it's necessarily the same scale. And then I'll start doing this with every lens and record the nodal points on my phone on a note so that I have it with me all the time. And that's how I do the nodal point. So now that I've shown you how to find the nodal point, let me talk about some uses that I've had for this technique. I mentioned earlier that I had actually used a multi-row pano technique to get an image even when I was having technical issues. And those issues came about on my very first trip out west with the GFX. I came out west, or went out west, with both my GFX kit, which at the time consisted of one body, the 63mm lens, and the 120mm macro. I also took my Nikon D800 and D850 kit that I had been using for years, but had grown to like the way the GFX worked for me so much that on this one particular trip to Waterholes Canyon, I decided to only take and only pack the GFX kit. So I didn't have the Nikon kit at all with me. And in the canyon, I experienced a problem with my 63mm lens. I got the dreaded, please turn off camera, turn it back on again error. But this was before I discovered anything about the nodal slide, the rail, and its interference when using a filter. I wasn't using a filter. This was an honest, true error with the lens. I think what happened was the day before I had been shooting with it in Antelope Canyon, and it was kind of windy day. Sand was blowing all over the place. I think some grains of sand got into the lens mechanism and jammed it and prevented it from doing that focus thing that it does when it first turns on. At least that's what I think happened. I sent it in for repair. Fuji replaced it and never heard what might have been the real cause. But I was stuck in a slot canyon with only my 120mm lens as my only working lens. And I came across this scene that I'll show now. And it was a pile of boulders kind of piled up in a curve in the canyon. And obviously the water that periodically floods through the canyon pushed the boulders into this curve and piled them up over time. And I love the scene. I love the tone of the boulders and the stripes on the canyon wall. But the canyon at this point was 8 to 10 feet wide, maybe. And the scene was, I mean, each boulder was a good 3 feet in size. And there was no way to shoot that scene in one image with the 120. It would have been perfect with the 63, I think. So what I did was I did a multi-row stitch. It was 2 images by 2 images to get the full scene. And I also discovered that using the depth of field scale on the LCD of the GFX, that with the 120, even stopped down all the way, I couldn't carry the depth of field through the entire scene. So not only did I have to do a multi-row pano, I had to do a focus stack on each piece of the pano. So I shot 3 images, moved the camera, shot 3 other images at the different focal points, moved the camera up, shot 3 images, moved the camera, shot 3 images. Using the focus scale on the LCD, I was able to put the focus point in the same place every time. So I had 12 images. I had to do the focus stack on each section, and then use the results of those to assemble the collage. And it worked out really well. It was a lot of effort, to put those images together, especially after, I mean, my trip was a full week plus out there, and so it was a good 2 weeks before I got back to the images to figure out what to do, and had to remind myself what I shot and why I shot it that way and how to put it together. It was kind of fun to try to go through that and remember what I was thinking. I need to take better notes in the field. But that was using this panorama technique to overcome a technical limitation with my gear. I've done panoramas of sunrises and sunsets, slow moving clouds, fast moving clouds. One tip that I can give, and I'll show you this image in particular, is if the clouds are moving fairly fast, shoot the sky first. I almost always shoot the sky first anyway. And if the motion of the clouds permits relative to the scene that I'm shooting, I will shoot in the direction the clouds are moving. So I'll start, if the clouds are moving from left to right, for instance, I will start in the upper left with the sky and shoot. So I'm minimizing the distance the clouds go across the scene because I'm shooting with them. And just try to shoot as fast as you can. If the clouds are really moving, there's no way you're going to capture that scene. So go to a single image. I've also combined the use of neutral density filters, graduated neutral density filters, with multi-row panoramas. And the image I was just talking about, this one, was an example of that. The sky was so bright relative to the river scene that I used a graduated neutral density. I think this image was 3 rows, and so I had density on the sky through the first 2 rows. And what I did is I shot the sky with the graduated neutral density in position, and then when I moved down to the second row, I slid the graduated neutral density filter up to keep it out of the shadow area of the river, shot that, and then on the third row just removed the filter entirely because there was no sky in that row, visible in that row. So I've combined focus stacking, I've combined the use of graduated neutral density filters. Yeah, and so those are some complicating techniques that I've used to make things hard for myself, quite frankly. But like I said, I'm addicted to that resolution. I like to know the details there. Some things that give me trouble with this technique: moving water. So the scene I just showed, after the stitching was done, I had to go in and manipulate certain areas of the scene because the way water flows, especially with long exposures, the images won't line up quite right. So there'll be a line where different shades and whatnot won't quite line up. And so I have to go into Photoshop and use spotting techniques and blending techniques to try to erase those lines and make it look natural. But flowing water has always given me a hard time. Fast moving clouds, as I mentioned, will give you a hard time. Wind-blown trees, not conducive to stitched images, unless you can get pretty much everything in one frame and not have overlap in the vegetation that might be blowing. Speaking of overlap, shoot a lot of overlap. In the scene in my last video, the Richmond skyline, I probably had the minimum amount of overlap. I could have used a bit more. You really want 1/3 to 1/2 of each frame to overlap. I had 1/3 at best. And so I think that contributed to the overall size of the final image because I didn't have that much overlap. So the total width of the scene was much larger than I really needed, or the horizontal dimensions, number of pixels that resulted was more than needed. I mentioned with the Horseshoe Bend sunset image, I couldn't see very well because it was getting so dark, so I was very cautious in the amount of overlap and probably had too much overlap. Some scenes I think I had overlap by like 2/3 or more, and so I had more images than needed to actually create the scene. Yeah, so those are some tips that I have. Shoot the sky first. Try to avoid windy days and flowing water unless you want to put a lot of effort into cleanup afterwards. And get the overlap right. Like I said, I'll shoot a video coming up on testing whether something like this is still needed these days. I got to find a scene with enough foreground background distance that I can see about shooting it handheld or just on a tripod with no pano head, and compare the results with pano head with a proper nodal point alignment. So I will do that in an upcoming video, so stay tuned. Please, if you like my content and want to see me improve over the years as I create videos, please think about subscribing. Just hit that button below. And please leave a comment. Let me know what you think. If you have any ideas for content that you would like to see me film, by all means, let me know. And thanks for watching my video, and I will see you next time.